I want to thank Annalisa, and I want to thank everyone for coming. This is, I think this is an important topic, and so I hope it's interesting, and I hope we can share some thoughts and ideas about it. So David Hume, David Hume wrote an essay called of miracles, and in this essay he basically defined a miracle in his term as a violation of the laws of nature. And basically Hume was an empiricist in the sense that he believed that experience was really was our fundamental way of determining reality. So whenever we removed ourselves from experience, that is, had to rely on testimony, for Hume that was kind of a step down. Okay, now his argument of miracles could be sort of summarized it's basically an attack against, or basically it focuses on the unreliability of human testimony, especially regarding religious miracles. He pointed out religious miracles are events that are extremely rare. They have a tendency to sort of invoke a kind of passion and wonder, which I think for Hume disengages us from our critical faculties. And miracles tended to happen or to occur in remote places where there were few witnesses. And Hume also noticed that throughout time, men have been dishonest, have had tendency to exaggerate things, perhaps to kind of, get listeners, maybe even to get a sense of power. So all of this meant for Hume that the probabilities associated with a miracle, or that is, essentially with the testimony regarding miracle, is always going to be substantially smaller than the probability associated with what he would call reliable testimony, which is basically the kind of testimony that we're familiar with, testimony that's actually very congruent with our day-to-day experience. So for Hume, we should never accept a miracle. Okay, now, as I'm going to talk about, the psi critics have a tendency to sort of employ this argument throughout many of their arguments, and it does a lot of heavy lifting. So, but before I get to that, I want to just summarize. Recently, Edsel Cardena has presented a very convenient summary of the meta-analysis of psi data that has occurred in laboratories. And this is not a conclusive, but there's definitely a lot of material that has been sort of different modes of psi, such as telepathy, precognition, remote viewing, presentiment. And these studies have become so numerous that they've actually been pooled into meta studies. And as you can see, this is sort of a shortened version of Table 1 from his paper. There's over 800 studies we're talking about that are the basis of all these different meta-analysis. And these have happened over decades, accumulated from different laboratories, different researchers. And as you can see in the right-hand column, the p-values suggest that the odds or the likelihood that these sort of effects could be due to chance is just astronomically nil or negligible. Okay, so he also presents another table that has to do with anomalous perturbation, or what most people, I think, would call psychokinesis. There, the p-values are a bit smaller, with the exception of Roger Nelson's global consciousness, but still looks like there is, across the board, some significant level of mind-matter interaction. Although some parapsychologists do question the interpretation of that, it looks like there's something going on. So, so now I want to get to Rebek and Alcock's argument using Hume. Although it's important to point out that Hume's argument has really been a kind of workhouse for the psi skeptics throughout the decades of debate between psi skeptics and psi advocates. Chuck Honorton mentioned Price's 1955 critique of Rhine's paper. In the paper, Price basically says he says that Rhine has presented us with enough evidence to convince us that there is something going on along the lines of telepathy, but then he acknowledges that David Hume's argument by itself was sufficient to convince him that it had to be wrong. And so occasionally, David Hume's argument has sort of popped up here and there. Wagenmacher's attack on Bem's precognition, for example. Most recently, Rebek and Alcock dismiss all the cite evidence presented in Cardena. So I'm just going to give you the bare bones of the argument there. First of all, Rebek and Alcock claim that the cite evidence violates important principles that are established in physics. And they list these principles as including no causal mechanism, reverses cause and effect, violates thermodynamics, and violates inverse square laws, okay? Now, this is sufficient. These violation of principles signifies a violation of natural laws, and therefore they can invoke Hume's argument that the cite evidence must be classified as miraculous, and therefore we must dismiss the cite evidence no matter how much evidence accumulates. So you can see Hume's argument here is actually kind of like doing some pretty heavy lifting. And it raises an interesting sort of question in the philosophy of science, because in science we usually sort of depend very heavily on evidence. But if the evidence under some circumstances can be swept away, then we're sort of left kind of with this sort of interesting problem about how to tell when we're doing science and when we're not doing science, and all kinds of interesting questions come up. Okay, so let's remind ourselves though that Hume's argument was primarily aimed at the sort of the faulty nature of religious testimony. Okay, so what about how do we sort of transfer that kind of argument into the laboratory? That's something that the skeptics don't really pay a lot of attention to, in my view. There's a few other sort of problems too that I'll say a few more words about. We can note that the evidence that they base these principles on, the ones that I just went over, are generally taken from physics, classical physics in particular, areas of science that we know a lot about. But the psi data arguably might be a different set of data, maybe data that has to do with maybe consciousness of some kind, maybe even quantum mechanics, because a lot of the psychokinesis data does use random number generators that are based on principles of quantum mechanics. And that raises another question of whether the psi might be characterized as miraculous or instead as anomalous in some sense. That is real, but just not fitting into our current understanding of the world. Okay, perhaps there may be gaps remaining in our understanding of the world, and if so, could the psi data fall into these gaps and perhaps help us understand what's going on with some of these persistent mysteries, I guess you could call them. Okay. Recently, I found this critique of some of the psi data by Sean Carroll, and he doesn't mention Hume, but he's sort of another example of someone who's using an argument that's very similar in the sense that the psi data seems to be so contrary to scientific principles as we know them that it probably is very unlikely. Of course, Sean Carroll is someone who advocates the many worlds, which is also kind of a radical claim, which has zero evidence as far as I know. And so it's kind of an interesting position that he is, of sort of being a psi skeptic, but at the same time advocating something else that might arguably be, that some might find to be kind of radical. Okay, so it turns out that Hume does have in his essay something that we can sort of like see is adaptable to the laboratory, though. And rather than sort of read this to you, I'm just going to summarize. Basically, the idea is that when we're doing experiments and observations, we can sort of see that there's experiments that fall on one side, and there's experiments that sort of have a different effect. And we can sort of see a kind of the accumulation of experiments as being kind of a way of weighing the two. And if one side is, let's say, heavier, if we think of a scale, we can think of one side as being really a lot heavier than the other. The degree that one is heavier or let's say has a much larger number, gives a sense of what it's more likely. Really, it's kind of a common sense way of the way we would think of experiments. But the important point here is that Hume does seem to suggest that in a laboratory under controlled conditions, that numbers do matter, and we want to pay very close attention to how many outcomes we get on one side versus another. Now it turns out, though, that having said that, there is kind of a lifeline that Hume's paper gives to the skeptics, and that is there is the possibility of fraud or some sort of questionable research practices going into the laboratory. Now, so while a lot of the problems that Hume worried about are sort of not really applicable in a laboratory, he does give us reason to think that there might be some dishonesty or some questionable practices, okay? So, and it turns out there is, historically speaking, some evidence of fraud in psi research. Walter Levy and Soule, and these are the prominent examples that usually are discussed. It's worth pointing out that the data here is not included in the meta-analysis. It's also worth pointing out that Walter Levy was actually discovered by other psi researchers, which is kind of interesting. It sort of, I think, goes to the point that the psi researchers do have a kind of cultural of vigilance, that is, trying to be on the lookout for anything that's not quite kosher. It's also worth pointing out that both of these paid very heavy prices when the fraud was discovered, although I think Soule was discovered after his passing. But certainly it cast a shadow on all their research, even research that had been perhaps not involved in any kind of fraud, okay? So is that sufficient to really just kind of say, well, okay, some fraud has happened, we should sort of like, well, of course, that's not really the way that science works in general. Fraud occurs. We generally sort of don't, toss out, various kinds of research that other people have done that might be similar if they haven't been, accused of fraud or actually haven't been established as having fraud. So there is a literature on fraud, a survey, and I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce his name right, Chevassus-Au-Louis, found scientific fraud to be correlated with often prospects of job placement and academic prestige. Okay, so you can sort of imagine the situation where someone wants to maintain a prestigious academic position, or wants to sort of be hired by a university, but just doesn't have that publication, or maybe a publication that has the right kind of finding. And so there's there can be a lot of pressure to kind of maybe alter the results. Maybe that might even seem benign to the person committing it. But we can note that historically, psi researchers have not improved their job prospects through psi research. Okay, so the kind of motivations and incentives that have been associated with fraud in more, let's say, mainstream research are not actually present. And I've noticed, and I've called attention to the fact that people who have committed fraud in psi, paid a very large price. It's not really clear that there's any kind of benefit. Even, let's say, if you talk about Daryl Bim, I mean, it got a lot of attention, but it's not really clear that in terms of prestige, or certainly in terms of money, that it really gave him, gave him much. So by and large, we can notice that the incentives to commit fraud in the psi community are probably substantially less. That would be my view from from the data on the nature of fraud. We can also notice that this kind of like culture or the historical kind of pattern in the psi community has led arguably to improvements in quality. Cardena cites studies that find the psi effects do not diminish with variables representing quality. You can note that parapsychology journals have a tendency to encourage publication where no results of note are found, or when the null it can't be rejected. Sheldrake found high quality, that the Psi research had a tendency to lead the way in high quality. So I'll say a little bit more, just going to history here. There's the Ganzfeld method, which I think many of you understand. Ganzfeld employed was a methodology pioneered by Chuck Honorton, employed noise reduction based on the idea that sensory deprivation heightens areas of consciousness more sensitive to psi. After 28 Ganzfeld studies, Honorton and Hyman, a psi critic, collaborated and generated a set of protocols. This, of course, is well known. Eliminating sources of sensory linkage, pioneering automation of selection of images shown to the sender, and so forth. And the important point here is that you have sort of this collaboration really does suggest that that it's something different from what I think most sort of mainstream researchers sort of endure, to kind of generate a very tight quality control. And the results have been 108 studies, which show, highly significant with astronomically small likelihood of chance. Okay. Now, recently there have been some psi researchers that have said, look, can we explain the Ganzfeld meta-analysis through some combination of questionable research practices and fraud occurring simultaneously? And they borrowed the sort of the levels of questionable research practices that have been sort of obtained through surveys in more mainstream areas of research. But as I've noted, given the Ganzfeld's history, it's probably a bit of a stretch to assume that the same level of QRPs and fraud is that it's comparable. It's probably a little bit of a stretch. Palmer's also criticized the number of assumptions that Bierman and his co-authors found. So even with, however, that kind of questionable that questionable assumption about the levels of questionable practices, they still could not account for the whole effect. Although, as I pointed out, the p-value is smaller than 10 to the minus 16, they were able to drop it quite a bit to 0.005, but still there seems to be a very substantial sort of real effect. And then if we sort of go back, maybe I should just, if I can do this quickly, if you can sort of imagine doing a similar exercise where you sort of plug in QRPs to all of these, and sort of like, what are you going to find? Well, it looks like you'd probably end up with a sort of a joint p-value that is still astronomically small. I mean, the likelihood that all of these, even if you have something on the level of p equals 0.05, if you sort of bring all of those and ask yourself, well, what is the likelihood that all of these data are generated by some sort of like combination of fraud and questionable research practices? It seems like we're still kind of stuck in this very extremely unlikely kind of situation. So now Doug Stokes is someone who said, wait a minute, maybe there's just fraud across the board. Maybe there's even some sort of coordination between researchers. So it almost seems like we have to go down the road of maybe considering a conspiracy theory. Usually scientists sort of roll their eyes at this point and say, well, conspiracy theories are just inherently unlikely in the extreme. In this case, remember, that would mean you would have various researchers somehow able to sort of maintain a coordination and silence of some kind of fraud over decades. And exactly what are the benefits from doing that? It's just not really clear, but we also know that it would sort of be catastrophic in terms of people's reputations, so there'd be a huge cost. So all the answers really, when we take a hard look at fraud, it really seems inherently unlikely. So let's consider the other side of the equation. Is it possible there's something really going on that we should be paying attention to? Well, one thing, let's come back to our original sort of question where I said it looks like the psi skeptics are basing their whole argument in large part on looking at various kinds of constraints or principles based on one set of data that they're applying to another set of data. But is that really valid? Hume, in another important argument, argued that we never directly experience causation or causal relationships, but rather only the regularities of how objects move together. So for Hume, there was always this substantial gap between what was ultimately, let's say, matters of causation and our experience. And because this gap is always present, we can never really fully characterize to some arbitrarily precise way what the causal laws actually are. And thus, it seems to invalidate this attempt by the skeptics to take principles that are sort of inferred in one area and move them to another. So in the history of science, we do have these episodes of anomalous findings regarding some new area of inquiry, and often the pattern is that we've got one sort of new domain. Let's say, for example, the way that Einstein explored relativity, we had Newton's laws, which worked very well, and then till finally we considered sort of maybe much larger areas of space where a much different kind of sort of laws of nature were needed. Quantum mechanics is another example, is non-classical in the sense that it entails some kind of non-local behavior. And these persistent mysteries of quantum mechanics suggests sort of a persistent gap in our understanding of the sort of deeper ontology of the physical world. And also, philosophers continue to struggle to fit consciousness or subjective experience in our theories based on the physical world. So Chalmers, David Chalmers, has coined the term hard problem of consciousness, and he's argued that consciousness is in some sense a kind of anomaly. Okay, so he says that consciousness right now is a kind of anomaly, one that we need to integrate into our view of the world, but don't really see how. Faced with an anomaly like this, radical ideas might be needed, and he says he thinks it may need one or two crazy ideas before we can really sort of make progress on the hard problem of consciousness. And Chalmers is someone who argues that we probably need to take consciousness as fundamental in some sense, not something that just emerges from non-conscious particles. Another philosopher of consciousness, Keith Frankish, has sort of a very different view of consciousness. He says that consciousness is truly anomalous in the sense of being radical, inexplicable within our established scientific worldview, but he views the idea that consciousness is so radical from our conventional views that it's probably some kind of illusion. It's probably something that's not really as real as we think it is, which of course is kind of a strange thing because it just seems like the one thing we should maybe take as real as our conscious experience. But Frankish feels that we should probably find ways where we're not really having consciousness the way we think are. Now, if you think about this, this is kind of astonishing because it means with regarding consciousness, we may have two sets of data, the psi data and our own experiences that suggest that consciousness is really something that doesn't fit in with our conscious experience. If we do take our conscious experiences as real and therefore anomalous, it really, in my view, opens the door, or should I open our minds to the idea that maybe the psi data is sort of telling us something about the nature of consciousness. So if we think about the psi data, it arguably falls into the domains of quantum mechanics and consciousness. These two areas that we're still sort of like trying to understand. Like I said before, the psi data, some of the psi data does sort of seem to be linked with quantum mechanics. Dean Radin also has some experiments on the double slit experiment, which suggests some sensitivity to mental intention. So it seems like these persistent areas give us reason to think that, you know, the psi data is something that we have to take more seriously and can't just sweep away. So just in conclusion, to wrap things up, I want to point out that the probability that the data summarized recently by Cardena is generated, that is the probability that it's generated by fraudulent or questionable practices, it appears to be extremely unlikely. And further, I believe Hume would not endorse what the practice of extrapolating principles or constraints that are inferred from one domain, such as physics, and sort of like try to sort of apply them in a very different one, okay, such as consciousness. And as it happens, the psi data seems to fall within domains where there remain persistent gaps in our understanding. As I said, quantum mechanics and consciousness. So overall, I believe the greater likelihood is that psi, as with consciousness, represents something that's real yet anomalous, not quite clear how it fits in to our sort of more conventional understandings. Now, I'm not certain to answer my sort of question in the title. I'm not sure Hume would agree with all this. I mean, I guess we could try to, maybe reanimate his body, his corpse, but then that would be a miracle, and I think he would be very put off by that. So anyway, it's probably best to say that we don't really know what he would say, but it's possible. But I think what we can say is that his arguments do not provide the resources that psi skeptics maintain to dismiss the psi data. So anyway, I want to now thank you.
I'm going to hand York the mic.
Well, I'm sorry to say that this isn't exactly a question, except maybe a rhetorical one.
Mm-hmm.
But I notice that the Rebek and Alcock paper invokes the inverse square law criticism for what is probably the 1000th time over the last century. And the problem with it, I don't see why anyone takes it seriously, because our everyday experience is full of genuine physical phenomena that don't obey the inverse square law. The best example for a brief response is radio broadcasts. The signal-to-noise ratio of a radio broadcast does obey the inverse square law. But what you hear, what comes out of the speaker of a radio, we don't perceive radio directly. We perceive the informational content of a signal that is broadcast using radio, and as long as the signal-to-noise ratio is above the threshold that our receiver can discriminate, we get exactly the same broadcast, whether we're 1,000 miles away or standing right next to the broadcast station. The information content does not pay attention to the inverse square law. So there are other complaints I could make about the Rebek and Alcock paper, but I think I should leave that to leave open the space for other people.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, I did a paper version where I critiqued Rebek and Alcock that was in a previous issue of Journal of Scientific Exploration, and I sort of went into more detail each of the sort of principles, and I said why I think they don't really work, while they may arguably work in sort of classical physics, how they arguably don't quite work well in if we want to look in areas such as consciousness and quantum mechanics. But I did not use your point, York, so I appreciate you for sharing that. But I did look at their principles, and just to kind of one in particular is lack of causal mechanism. That this is kind of also Wagenmacher also attacked Bim in that the idea is that we need a sort of causal mechanism. One problem with that is that in quantum mechanics, the collapse of the wave function, or as David Bohm explains in his interpretations of quantum mechanics, causal mechanisms don't really seem to play the kind of role in quantum mechanics, if at all. And then David Chalmers actually sort of characterizes the hard problem as trying to sort of explain the aspects of consciousness that can't be really characterized in terms of sort of mechanisms and functions. So, once we sort of leave the confines of classical physics, these principles, I think that Rebek and Alcock want to sort of hinge so much of their argument on, kind of falter. Okay. Anybody?
Okay. I see another raised hand. Okay. I'm going to hand, I think it's Kenny, the mic.
The thing that's been bothering me throughout this discussion so far is something that I think as members of SSE we would all more or less agree on, and that's the idea that our understanding of physics is woefully incomplete.
Mhm.
It is severely limited, and to say that physics can't explain X, Y, or Z really to me means we have not yet arrived at a complete understanding of physics. So saying that something lacks a causal mechanism and therefore that thing isn't real, well, I would hasten to remind the speaker, not you, but the speaker in general, that we don't understand all kinds of things that a revision of physics, a severe revision of physics, might eventually help us understand. So I'm all into causal mechanisms, but I just don't think we're smart enough yet. And I don't know if that's a question or just a comment, but I would be interested in how you feel about that.
Yeah, what's interesting in the Rebek and Alcock paper, they actually acknowledge the fact that Sir Isaac Newton, his theory of gravitation didn't really have a mechanism. It's sort of an action at a distance that seems to, but yet people and people talked about how that worried them a little bit, and it worried Newton too. But it's that people used it. People found it to be very useful, very accurate way of sort of describing the behavior of objects. So in their own paper, they seem to kind of acknowledge that sometimes we don't really need a causal mechanism to sort of like go along with to at least try to sort of explain or at least describe aspects of the world. So they kind of in a way defeat their own claim in a way. And as I said also that there may well be areas of physics that maybe that don't involve sort of those kinds of causal mechanisms. But you're quite right. There may be causal mechanisms that we just don't know about, and that's another possibility. So anyway, I take your point that, and I think they, sort of, they're sort of vulnerable to critique as well.
All right, Logan has his hand up.
Hi, Logan.
Hi, George. I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry. Here we go. Hi. We talked a bit over email. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful talk. I have a question. I have plenty of comments, but I have a question, which is, I'm going to assume that you are familiar with the famous Sagan standard, described in the aphorism, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah.
Curious how you would map Hume's view to that standard, which is something that's always bothered me. I'm an experimentalist, mm-hmm. And for all you experimentalists out there, if trying to get a paper just of some ordinary claim through peer review, oftentimes it seems to require extraordinary evidence to convince these reviewers. So I've never really bought into this criterion, and so listening to your talk on Hume, I was wondering if you could see a mapping between the two.
Yeah. Well, Hume sort of, I think, tries to argue that miracles are kind of like just inherently the testimony regarding miracles is just inherently unreliable. I think that Sagan's idea is a little bit different from Hume, although they are sort of comparable. I guess the problem I have with Sagan's is I don't know. I mean, there's not much of a definition around what extraordinary means. To me, like there's the I mentioned briefly Sean Carroll. So he claims that the best explanation of quantum mechanics is the multiverse. That is, every time there's a quantum event, the universe splits. But we can never see it because we're in one universe and then there's another universe. Now, that's a pretty extraordinary claim in my view. In fact, it's probably way more extraordinary than Psi. But Psi actually has evidence, whereas Sean Carroll doesn't really provide any evidence other than just simply an argument around the interpretation of the wave function. So this notion of extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence. It seems like it depends on it doesn't seem to be a principle that's kind of used in a consistent way across science. And of course the terms extraordinary seems to be kind of vague or ill-defined. As I mentioned in my talk, I think that Keith Frankish, the philosopher of consciousness, would argue that consciousness, our conscious experiences, are actually so extraordinary that we should probably say that they're unlikely to exist. Okay, that's kind of a way he argues. So it's a very inherently problematic kind of maxim when you try to apply it sort of outside, especially in these areas like quantum mechanics and consciousness, where we have these sort of persistent mysteries. I guess the way to try to do a mapping, to try to come back to your question, is that we would, maybe someone with Hume's, it seems like that they were saying that if something's extraordinary, we would have to have a lot of data, a lot of experiments to kind of like confirmation of confirmation. But the problem there, in my view, we sort of have that. We have a lot of data. We have meta-analysis based on studies across time, across different laboratories and researchers, different modalities such as precognition, presentiment, remote viewing, and so forth. So it just seems like, even on that score, we could probably even manage it. So when I hear the term or that maxim, I'm thinking that what people are trying to get into is more of a social construction. In other words, we're just, things like Psi are just outside of science. They don't really have, it's in the sense that it just, to them, maybe conjures, associations with religion or something like that, so that so in other words, it's very difficult to sort of apply scientific principles and be consistent about it and say that Psi doesn't exist. So there's all these other kinds of arguments that are sort of thrown around, and at the end of the day, it seems like the arguments, in my view, are kind of weak. So I don't know. I hope some of that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Logan. All right. So I have a question from Dachin Piao. He says that inverse square does not apply to all physical phenomena. For example, laser propagation does not abide the inverse square law. Every music was once new, and every physical phenomenon was once anomalous. What if Psi is a kind of coherent phenomenon?
What if Psi was a coherent phenomenon?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not exactly sure I understand the question, but I certainly take your point that everything that we're learning in the universe, by coherent, I assume you mean it actually is kind of normal. That is, it fits with our reality. It's coherent in that sense. I'm sort of presuming that that's.
I'm going to presume.
Yeah, I'm presuming that. That is to say that it may seem anomalous because we've got this set of data from classical physics that suggests, well, it can't fit. But everything, as you point out, does seem anomalous at first when you're first learning about it. So it could well be that it's maybe not only maybe it's just normal. And I think that I think is a really good way of thinking about Psi, assuming that's what you're suggesting. And I think that oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank here. Let's see, it's First Sight. It's First Sight. I'm trying to think of the author's name. Carpenter. That's it. Basically, develops a very sophisticated framework for psychology, thinking of Psi as just normal, but it sort of comes through our subconscious. And he's got a very sort of rich framework for understanding how, based on various mechanisms in our psychology, how we might be filtering out the psi information, or actually sort of like using it to inform our world. So I think that he's got a good sort of framework for exploring psi as something normal, that most of us sort of have to some degree, and maybe we just sort of have to get past this idea that it's somehow something that's kind of strange, but actually it's just part of our world that we are learning about. So anyway, hope that's...
So I've got one more raised hand and then a final question from York, and that's all the time we're going to have. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Newsy, and that will be the last raised hand question for today.
So my question was triggered by the mention of conspiracy theory, that, you know, there is this sort of wild conjecture that there might be a conspiracy theory by people who proponents of psi. So we could turn this around and say that it could be that psi is not accepted in spite of the voluminous evidence because there is a conspiracy theory against psi. I'm not suggesting there is, but we could turn the tables around because there is at least probably cognitive dissonance and resistance, maybe unconscious resistance, because it seems to me that conventional religion might be threatened. They would probably have a lot to lose if it turned out that psi is true, because various claims about prayers and miracles, the way they're explained traditionally in conventional religion, would have to be modified. So one is just sort of a sarcastic sort of comment. Okay, you know, if they're saying that we have doing a conspiracy theory, maybe somebody is doing it against the psi folk. So that's just a sort of facetious comment. But on a serious note, I was wondering if someone has written a paper or compiled some thoughts about if psi was, well, it's already proved in my opinion and yours also, but if it was accepted widely, in a wider sense by the public at large, who are the parties that would stand to lose, either materially or in terms of prestige or whatever? So we would just conjecture that perhaps those are the parties who are resisting it most. So that's my question.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, right off the bat, in my opinion, I think that, you know, there are a lot of scientists, let's say, many of whom are very prestigious, have kind of staked a lot on the fact that psi is kind of nonsense. So, you know, maybe they would be viewed as being sort of on the wrong side of history, or maybe, you know, just sort of maybe their prestige would lose. I think this is a very interesting question, in the sense that it does seem like there's kind of a resistance that is that seems to be beyond what you would normally think of is rational in a way. That's I mean, often when you see some of the arguments made by psi skeptics, you feel like it's almost like they're willfully ignoring very important pieces of the data. And so I remember a little while ago, I read Steven Pinker's recent book. It's called, I forgot what it's called, Enlightenment. And he actually sort of mentions psi in passing, basically just says, well, you know, this stuff is weird. And that's all he says. He doesn't engage with the data, doesn't really even, you know, kind of bring up any arguments at all. And he's written a huge book that's all about the importance of taking science seriously. So it's a very sort of like strange kind of thing. And my own theory, if you will, it's not really a conspiracy theory, but I think the way that a lot of academia and prestigious universities work, that it's very important that they maintain their brand, okay? So Harvard, Princeton, all of these very prestigious schools, a lot of what, I mean, if you look at the tuition and the grants that they sort of bring in, huge sums of money, and that in large part is due to the ability to maintain a kind of brand that science is real. And as a product of history, probably more than anything else, psi just simply has the wrong brand. It's associated with, you know, maybe the supernatural. in its history, and perhaps to some degree even to the present day. So that means that any individual university that sanctions research into psi has a tendency for it to be looked at for the other various kinds of institutions as sort of maybe damaging their brand, or that is, I think that they would see themselves as risking damaging their brand. And remember, their brand is crucial in terms of getting tuition and grant money and really very large sums of money. So I think that this sort of like problem that the universities have, they have to, I mean, certain types of research, of course, are very important, but questionable research, there's a real risk. So I think, in my view, I wouldn't characterize it as a conspiracy theory, more of a kind of way that that unfortunately the universities have a tendency to depend too strongly on a kind of vision of science and what science is and what it's not being. And if the world doesn't really fit into those boxes, then there's a lot of resistance. So anyway, that's my own conjecture. I certainly welcome other people's opinions as well.
But may I just add just a couple of comments? So thank you very much for your answer. I would just want to add, and I don't know if you'll agree or not, but in addition to everything you said, so that, they have this box in which they fit science and the world and so forth. I think in this particular case, it also threatens the box into which they fit religion. So they fit religion in a box where it's, it's just in your mind and there's a God in your mind and you talk to that God. But this would tend to give a different explanation to spirituality, so that even the box in which they want to keep religion is threatened. And the religious people, like some huge big Catholic university or whatever, would not want to invest in this kind of research because, again, it shakes where they want religion to be as opposed to this newer view. So anyway, just
I've heard other parapsychologists who talk about this problem, and they probably would maybe agree with you more than me. I think they feel that this sort of research does in some ways threaten people with strong religious convictions, and some of those are large donors, or they're very influential politically. So I think that there's some psi researchers who believe that the government funding of remote viewing was in some ways cut off because some of the people in the military were sensitive were actually kind of had certain religious beliefs, or they were sensitive to senators who had strong religious beliefs. So I think that the religion aspect of it is also a major factor. I tend to lean more toward the other, but I think parapsychologists probably would say maybe the religion plays a very strong, if not the strongest role.
Okay, thank you for your questions and comments, Newsy. We're going to end with a question from York. I think this is a good closer. And the question is, does this talk have a bibliography or reference list that could be sent out by mail to interested parties?
I don't have it right now, but I am working on a paper, and so I'll be happy to send you the paper version or just the list of references when that's done. And I should have something like that done in about a week or two, so it won't be very long. So I'd be happy to send either the paper or just the bibliography.
Okay, and I'd be happy to facilitate that if necessary.